Chapter 5. Jill took in their new surroundings as she caught her breath, feeling like she was a character in a nightmare that had just taken a turn into grand fantasy. Wild, howling monsters, Joseph's sudden death, a terrifying run through the dark woods, and now this.
Deserted, huh?
The place was a palace, pure and simple, what her father would have called a perfect score. The room they escaped into was the very epitome of lavish. It was huge, easily bigger than Jill's entire house, tiled in gray-flecked marble and dominated by a wide carpeted staircase that led to a second-floor balcony. Arched marble pillars lined the ornate hall, supporting the dark heavy wood balustrade of the upper floor. Fluted wall sconces cast funnels of light across walls of cream, trimmed in oak and offset by the deep burnt ochre of the carpeting. In short, it was magnificent. "What is this?" Barry muttered. No one answered him. Jill took a deep breath and decided immediately she didn't like it. There was a sense of wrongness to the vast room, an atmosphere of vague oppression. It felt haunted somehow, though by who or what, she couldn't say.
Beats the hell out of getting eaten by mutant dogs, though. Gotta give it that much.
And on that trail of thought,
Good God. Poor Joseph.
there hadn't been time to mourn him, and there wasn't time now. But he would be missed. She walked towards the stairs clutching her handgun, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet that led from the front door. There was an antique typewriter on the small table to the right of the steps, a blank sheet of paper spooled into the works. A strange bit of decoration. The expansive hall was otherwise empty. She turned back towards the others, wondering what their take on all this was. Barry and Chris both looked uncertain, their faces flushed and sweaty as they surveyed the room. Wesker was crouched by the front door, examining one of the latches. He stood up, his dark shade still in place, seeming as detached as ever. "The wood around the lock is splintered. Somebody broke this door open before we got here." Chris looked hopeful. "Maybe it's the Bravos." Wesker nodded. "That's what I'm thinking. Help should be on the way soon. Assuming, of course, our friend Mr. Vickers even bothers to call it in." The sarcasm in his voice was obvious, and Jill felt her own anger kindling. Brad had screwed up big time, had almost cost them their lives. There was no excuse for what he had done. Wesker continued, walking across the room towards one of the two doors on the west wall. He rattled the handle, but it didn't open. "It's not safe to go back out. Until the cavalry arrives, we may as well take a look around. Now, it's obvious that somebody's been keeping this place up. Though why and for how long?" He trailed off, walking back towards the group. "How are we set for ammo?" Jill ejected the clip from her Beretta and counted. 3 rounds left, plus 2 loaded magazines on her belt. 33 shots. Chris had 22 left, and Wesker 17. Barry had 2 racked speed loaders for his Colt, plus an extra handful of loose cartridges tucked into a hip pouch. 19 rounds in all. Jill thought about all the equipment that was back on the helicopter and felt another rush of anger towards Brad. Ammunition, flashlights, walkie-talkies, shotguns, not to mention medical supplies. The Beretta that Joseph had found out in the field, the pale, blood-splattered fingers still wrapped around it. A STARS team member could be dead or dying, and thanks to Brad, they didn't even have a Band-Aid to offer. A sound of something heavy sliding to the floor, somewhere close by. In unison, they turned toward the single door on the east wall. Jill was instantly reminded of every horror movie she had ever seen. A strange house, a strange noise. She shivered, and decided that she was definitely going to kick Brad's narrow ass when they got out of here. "Chris, go investigate and report back ASAP," Wesker said. "We'll wait here in case the RPD comes knocking. You run into trouble, fire your weapon and we'll find you." Chris nodded and started towards the door, his boots clacking loudly against the marble floor. Jill felt a sense of foreboding wash over her again.
Chris.
His hand on the knob, he turned back, and she realized that there was nothing she could tell him that made any sense. Everything was happening so fast. There was so much wrong with this situation that she didn't even know where to start.
And he's a trained professional, and so are you. Start acting like it. Take care of yourself,
She said finally. It wasn't what she wanted to say, but it would have to be enough. Chris gave her a lopsided grin, then raised his Beretta and stepped through the doorway. Jill heard the ticking of a clock, and then he was gone, closing the door behind him. Barry caught her gaze and smiled at her, a look that told her not to worry. But Jill couldn't shake the sudden certainty that Chris wouldn't be coming back. Chris swept the room, taking in the stately elegance of the environment as he realized he was alone. Whoever had made the noise, they weren't here. The solemn ticking of a grandfather clock filled the cool air, echoing off shining black and white tiles. He was in a dining hall, the kind he'd only seen in movies about rich people. Like the front hall, this one had an incredibly high ceiling and a second-floor balcony. But it was also decorated with expensive-looking art and had an inset fireplace at the far end, complete with a coat of arms and crossed swords that hung over the mantel. There didn't seem to be any way to get to the second floor, but there was a closed door to the right of the fireplace. Chris lowered his weapon and started for the door, still in awe by the wealth of the abandoned mansion that the stars had stumbled into. The dining room had polished redwood trim and expensive-looking artwork on the beige walls, surrounding a large wooden table that ran the length of the room. The table had to seat at least 20, but it was only set for only a handful of people, and judging from the dust on the lacy placemats, nothing had been served for weeks. Yeah, except no one's supposed to have been here for 30 years, let alone hosted a formal dinner. Spencer had the place closed down before anybody ever stayed here. Chris shook his head. It was obvious that someone had reopened it a long time ago. So how was it that everyone in Raccoon City believed the Spencer estate was a boarded-up, crumbling ruin out in the middle of the woods? And more importantly, why did Umbrella lie to Irons about its condition? Murders, disappearances, Umbrella, Jill. It was frustrating. He felt like he had some of the answers, but he wasn't sure of what questions to ask. He reached the door and turned the knob slowly, listening for any sound of movement on the other side. He couldn't hear anything over the ticking of the old clock. It was set against the wall, and each movement of the second hand reverberated hollowly, amplified by the cavernous room. The door opened into one side of a narrow corridor, dimly lit by antique light fixtures. Chris quickly checked both directions. To the right was maybe 10 meters of hardwood hall, a couple of doors across from him, and a door at the end of the corridor. To the left, the hallway took a sharp turn away from where he stood, widening out. He saw the edge of a patterned brown rug on the floor there. He wrinkled his nose, frowning. There was a vague odor in the air, a faint scent of something unpleasant, but familiar. He stood in the doorway another moment, trying to place the smell. One summer when he was a kid, the chain had come off his bike when he was out on a ride with some of his friends. He ended up in a ditch about 6 inches away from a choice bit of roadkill, the dried-up, pulpy remains of a woodchuck. Time and summer heat had dissipated the worst of the stink, though what had remained had been bad enough. Much to the amusement of his buddies, he vomited his lunch all over the carcass, taking a deep breath, and then puked again. He still remembered the sun-baked scent of drying rot, like thickly soured milk and bile. The same exact smell that lingered in the corridor now, like a bad dream. A soft shuffling noise from behind the first door on his right, like a padded fist sliding against a wall. Someone was on the other side. Chris edged into the hallway and moved towards the door, careful not to turn his back to the unsecured area. As he got closer, the gentle sounds of movement stopped, and he could see that the door wasn't closed all the way. No time like the present. With an easy tap, the door swung inward, into a dim hall with green-flecked wallpaper. A broad-shouldered man was standing not 20 feet away, half hidden in shadow, and his back to Chris. He turned around slowly, the careful shuffling of someone drunk or injured, and the smell that Chris had noticed before came off of the man in thick, noxious waves. His clothes were tattered and stained, the back of his head patchy with sparse, scraggly hair. Gotta be sick. Dying, maybe. Whatever was wrong with the guy, Chris didn't like it. His instincts were screaming at him to do something. He stepped into the corridor and trained his Beretta on the man's torso. Hold it! Don't move! The man completed his turn and started towards Chris, shambling forward into the light. Its face was deathly pale, except for the blood smeared around its rotting lips. Flaps of dried skin hung from its sunken cheeks, and the dark wells of the creature's eye sockets glittered with a hunger as it reached out with skeletal hands. Chris fired, 3 shots that smacked into the creature's upper chest in a fine spray of crimson. With a gasping moan, it crumbled to the floor, dead. Chris staggered back, his thoughts racing in time with his hammering heart. He hit the door with one shoulder, and was vaguely aware that it latched closed behind him as he stared at the fallen, stinking heap. Dead. That thing's the walking goddamn dead! The cannibal attacks in Raccoon, all of them near the forest. He'd seen enough late-night movies to know what he was looking at, but he still couldn't believe it. Zombies. No. No way. That was fiction. But maybe it was some kind of disease, mimicking the symptoms. He had to get to the others and tell them. He turned and grabbed the handle, but the heavy door wouldn't move. It must have locked when he stumbled. Behind him, a wet movement. Chris spun, eyes wide as the twitching creature clawed at the wooden floor, pulling itself towards him in eager, single-minded silence. Chris realized that it was drooling, and the sight of the sticky pink rivulets pulling to the wood floor finally spurred him into action. He fired again, 2 shots into the thing's decaying, upturned face. Dark holes opened up in its knobby skull, sending tiny rivers of fluid and fleshy tissue through its lower jaw. With a heavy sigh, the rotting thing settled to the floor in a spreading red lake. Chris didn't want to take any bets on it staying down. He gave one more futile yank on the door, and then stepped carefully past the body, moving down the corridor. He rattled the handle of a door on his left, but it was locked. There was a tiny etching on the key plate that looked like a sword. He filed that little bit of information into his confused, whirling thoughts and continued on, gripping the Beretta tightly. There was an offshoot off to his right with a single door, but he ignored it, wanting to find a way to circle back to the front hall. The others had to have heard the shots, but he had to assume that there were more creatures running around here like the ones he'd just killed. The rest of the team might already have their hands full. There was another door at the end of the hall on the left, where the corridor turned. Chris hurried towards it, the putrid scent of the creature. The zombie, Redfield, call it what it is, made him want to gag. As he neared the door, he realized that the smell was actually getting worse, intensifying with each step. He heard the soft, hungry moan as his hand touched the knob, even as it registered that he only had 2 bullets left in his clip. In the shadows to his right, there was movement. Shit! Gotta reload. Gotta get somewhere safe. Chris jerked the door open and stepped right into the arms of the shambling creature that waited on the other side, its peeling fingers grasping at him as it lunged for his throat. Three shots. Seconds later, 2 more. The sounds distant but distinct in the palatial lobby.
Chris!
Jill, Why don't you... Wesker started, but Barry didn't let him finish. I'm going to, he said, already starting for the door on the east wall. Chris wouldn't waste shots like that unless he absolutely had to. He needed help. Wesker relented quickly, nodding. All right, go. I'll wait here. Barry opened the door with Jill right behind him. They walked into a huge dining room, not as wide as the front hall, but at least as long. There was another door at the opposite end, past a grandfather clock that ticked loudly in the frigid, dusty air. Barry jogged towards it with his revolver in hand, feeling tense and worried. Christ, what a balls-up operation this was. STARS teams were often sent into risky situations where the circumstances were unusual, but this was the first time since he had been a rookie that Barry felt that things had gotten completely out of control. Joseph was dead, Chickenheart Vickers had left them to be eaten by mutant dogs from hell, and now Chris was in trouble. Wesker shouldn't have sent him in alone. Jill reached the door first, touching the handle with slim fingers and looking over to him. Barry nodded as she pushed it open, going in low and left. Barry took the other side, both of them sweeping an empty corridor.
Chris?
Jill called out quietly, but there was no answer. Barry scowled, sniffing the air. Something smelled bad. In fact, something smelled like shit. I'll go check the doors, Barry said. Jill nodded and edged to the left, alert and focused. Barry moved towards the first door, feeling good that Jill was at his back. He thought she was kind of bitchy when she first transferred, but she was proving to be a bright and capable soldier, a welcome addition to the Alphas. Jill let out a high-pitched gasp of surprise, and Barry spun, the scent of decay suddenly thick in the narrow hall. Jill was backing away from an opening at the end of the corridor, her weapon trained on something Barry couldn't see.
Stop!
Her voice was high and shaky, her expression horrified. And she fired, once, then twice, still backing towards Barry, her breathing fast and shallow. Get clear! Left! He raised the Colt as she moved out of the way, and a tall man stepped into view. The figure's arms were stretched out like a sleepwalker's, the hands frail and grasping. Barry saw the creature's face then and didn't hesitate. He fired, a .357 round peeling the top of its ashen skull away in an explosive burst, blood coursing down its strange, terrible features and staining the cataracts of its pale, rolling eyes. The creature pitched back, sprawling face up at Jill's feet. Barry hurried to her side, stunned. What the... he started, then saw what was on the carpet in front of them, lying in the small sitting area that marked the end of the corridor. Barry thought it was Chris for a moment, but then he saw the STARS Bravo insignia on the vest, and felt a different kind of horror set in as he struggled to recognize the features. The Bravo had been decapitated, the head laying a foot away from the corpse, and the face completely covered in gore. Oh, jeez. It's Ken. Kenneth Sullivan. One of the best field scouts Barry had ever known, and a hell of a nice guy. There was a gaping, ragged wound in his chest, chunks of partially eaten tissue and gut strewn across the bloody hole. His left hand was missing, and there was no weapon nearby. It must have been his gun that Joseph had found out in the woods. Barry looked away, sickened. Ken had been a quiet, decent sort, did a lot of work in chemistry. He had a teenage son who lived with his ex out in California. Barry thought about his own girls at home, Moira and Polly, and felt a surge of helpless fear for them. He wasn't afraid of death, but he was afraid of the thought of them growing up without a father. Jill dropped to a crouch next to his ravaged body and rifled quickly through his belt pack. She gave Barry an apologetic look, but he gave her a slight nod in return. They needed the ammo. Ken certainly didn't. She came up with 2 clips for a 9mm and tucked them into her hip pocket. Barry turned and stared down at Ken's murderer in disgust and wonder. He had no doubt that he was looking at one of the cannibal killers that had been preying upon Raccoon City. It had a crusty scum of red around its mouth and its gore-encrusted nails, as well as a ragged shirt that was stiff with dried blood. What was weird was how dead it looked. Barry had once done a covert hostage rescue in Ecuador, where a group of farmers had been held for weeks by a band of insane guerrilla rebels. Some of the hostages had been killed early in the siege, and after the Stars managed to capture the rebels, Barry had gone in with one of the survivors to record the deaths. The 4 victims had been shot, their bodies dumped behind the small wooden shack that the rebels had taken over. After 3 weeks in the South American sun, the skin on their faces had shriveled, the cracking lined flesh pulling away from sinew and bone. He still remembered those faces clearly, and saw them again now as he looked down at the fallen creature. It wore the face of death. Besides which, it smells like a slaughterhouse on a hot day. Someone forgot to tell this guy that dead people don't walk around. He could see the same sickened confusion on Jill's face, same questions in her eyes, but for now, there weren't any answers. They had to find Chris and regroup. Together, they moved back down the corridor and checked all 3 doors, rattling handles and pushing at the heavy wood frames. All were securely locked. But Chris had to have gone through one of them. There's nowhere else he could have gone. It didn't make any sense, and short of breaking the doors down, there was nothing else they could do about it.
We need to report this to Wesker,
Jill said, and Barry nodded in agreement. If they had stumbled into the hiding place of the killers, they were going to need a plan of attack. They ran back through the dining room, the stale air a relief after the corridor's reek of blood and decay. They reached the door back to the main hall and hurried through. Barry wondered what the captain would make of all this. It was downright Barry stopped short, searching the elegant, empty hall and feeling like the butt of some practical joke that simply wasn't funny. Wesker was gone.